Picture the dead of winter in the eastern woodlands. The air is so cold it burns the lungs, and the snow-choked pines stand in absolute, heavy silence. Suddenly, that silence is violently shattered. Not by the sharp crack of a flintlock musket, nor by the whistle of a war arrow, but by the concussive, earth-shaking roar of heavy artillery. A mortar shell arcs through the freezing air and detonates, sending lethal cast-iron shrapnel and splintered timber tearing through the tree line. We are taught that the 17th century in North America was defined by an unstoppable Iroquois blitzkrieg. The historical consensus paints the Five Nations as a supreme military force that rolled over the continent like an inevitable tide, erasing all indigenous opposition from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. But the colonial archives hide a different reality. They hide the cold, mechanical truth of a people who stalemated the Iroquois war machine for 25 years. What happens when a society of apex hunters bypasses the colonial gatekeepers, acquires European cannons, fortifies their settlements with geometric precision, and dictates the terms of a global fur market? It ceases to be a skirmish in the woods. It becomes a technological dead end for an expanding empire. History is never what you think. To understand this anomaly, you must immediately strip away the myth of the primitive, uncalculating frontier. We are not looking at an Indian war. We are looking at a highly organized, ruthless conflict for control over the primary trade corridors of North America. And in this conflict, the Susquehannocks, known in the terrified dispatches of the Dutch as the Minquas, were absolute pragmatists. They were brilliant logistical operators who understood the brutal mechanics of the New World better than the Europeans who claimed to own it. The Dutch West India Company held a stranglehold on the Hudson River, funneling firearms exclusively to their Iroquois trading partners in the north. The Susquehannocks, dominating the massive watershed of the Susquehanna River to the south, realized a fundamental rule of survival. Bows and arrows could not secure a trade corridor against Dutch steel. They needed an engineering baseline. Instead of fighting a losing battle of attrition, the Susquehannocks simply bypassed the Dutch monopoly. In 1638, the Kingdom of Sweden established a colony on the Delaware River, New Sweden. The Swedes, commanded by the heavy-handed governor Johan Prince, were desperate for a foothold in the lucrative fur trade, but lacked the military manpower to push into the hostile interior. The Susquehannocks recognized this desperation and forged a highly lucrative, militarized syndicate. If you look at the trade manifests of New Sweden, you do not see trades for glass beads, brass kettles, or woven blankets. The Susquehannocks demanded a hard industrial currency. They traded prime beaver pelts by the thousands. In return, they did not just ask for basic hunting rifles. They demanded heavy-caliber matchlock and flintlock muskets, massive reserves of black powder, lead molds, and most crucially, heavy artillery, specifically iron swivel guns and small mortars. They essentially bought their own military-industrial complex. But owning a gun is useless if you cannot maintain it. The Susquehannocks actively sought out Swedish gunsmiths to train their own warriors in the maintenance of firing mechanisms, the casting of lead balls, and the precise measurement of powder charges. By the mid-1650s, they had transformed themselves into the most heavily armed indigenous force on the Atlantic seaboard. They did not fight like a disorganized band of raiders. They fought like a corporate military entity, utilizing European ballistic technology to secure total dominance over the southern trade arteries. By 1663, the Iroquois Confederacy recognized that the Susquehannock logistical monopoly was an existential threat. The Iroquois had exhausted the beaver populations in their own trapping grounds. To survive the global economic market, they had to push south. They decided to permanently liquidate the Susquehannock anomaly. The western nations of the Confederacy, the Seneca and the Cayuga, amassed a strike force of 800 elite warriors. In the context of 17th century North America, an 800-man indigenous army was a staggering projection of power. This was the ultimate kinetic payload of the era, a force that had recently wiped the Huron and the Erie nations completely off the map. They marched south in the spring, expecting to easily overrun the Susquehannock towns with sheer numbers and aggressive shock tactics. But when the Iroquois vanguard arrived at the primary Susquehannock settlement on the western bank of the river, they did not find a traditional wooden palisade. They found a European-grade fortress. The Susquehannocks had not just bought Swedish guns, they had absorbed Swedish military engineering. They had constructed formidable, deeply entrenched defensive architecture. Historical surveys and colonial accounts describe a massive structure equipped with corner bastions. These bastions were the pinnacle of European siege engineering, protruding angles built into the walls that allowed the defenders to create overlapping fields of enfilading fire. Any Iroquois warrior attempting to rush the main wall would be caught in a deadly, mathematically precise crossfire from the flanks. Beyond the bastions, the Susquehannocks had dug deep, dry moats and raised heavy earthworks, backing the heavy wooden palisades with dirt, mud, and rubble to absorb incoming musket fire and prevent the walls from being burned. The Iroquois did not face a woodland skirmish. They were forced into a brutal, static siege. The Seneca and Cayuga attempted a mass infantry charge, carrying dry brush and torches to burn the gates. When they threw themselves against the walls, they were met with a horrific reality. The Susquehannocks did not just fire a volley of muskets. They unleashed coordinated artillery barrages. Iron swivel guns, mounted directly on the bastions, were loaded with grape shot. Tightly packed bags filled with heavy lead balls, nails, and jagged scrap iron. When fired at close range, a swivel gun does not kill a single man. It clears a geometric lane of human tissue. The artillery detonated, tearing through the massed Iroquois ranks with devastating kinetic force, shattering bones and severing limbs. The elite warriors of the Confederacy bled themselves dry, trying to breach earthworks designed to withstand professional European armies. The psychological shock was absolute. For the first time in their history of conquest, the Iroquois blitzkrieg was halted not by a superior number of men, but by superior industrial architecture and heavy ballistics. When the Iroquois offensive finally exhausted its momentum, breaking upon the walls like water against a stone, the Susquehannocks did not celebrate in the safety of their fort. Recognizing the shift in momentum, they opened the heavy timber gates and launched a devastating, highly disciplined counterattack. Armed with heavy war clubs and steel tomahawks, they fell upon the disorganized besiegers. The Iroquois force was completely routed, leaving their dead in the mud and fleeing north in a frantic, uncoordinated panic. The Susquehannocks were not defeated by the Iroquois. They were defeated by the cold reality of a global systemic failure. The conflict for the trade corridors of North America was entirely dependent on the distant, shifting geopolitics of European capitals. In 1664, the Anglo-Dutch Wars redrew the map of the continent. The English Navy seized New Netherland, and in the process, absorbed the territories of the Delaware River. The Swedish colony was already gone, swallowed by the Dutch, and now the English controlled everything from Boston to Virginia. Instantly, the Susquehannocks' primary logistical artery was severed. The British implemented a strict, continent-wide colonial consolidation. The surrounding colonies of Maryland and Virginia, deeply fearful of a heavily armed, independent indigenous nation sitting on their borders, enacted aggressive embargoes. They cut off the sale of powder, lead, and replacement parts to the tribe. In the unforgiving mathematics of war, a cannon without black powder is nothing more than a cold, useless cylinder of iron. A musket with a broken mainspring is just a heavy wooden club. You cannot forge lead from river stones, and you cannot synthesize saltpeter from pine needles. The technological edge that had kept the Iroquois at bay evaporated almost overnight. Simultaneously, the true apex predator of the continent bypassed the moats and the bastions, variola major, smallpox. The disease was catastrophic. Unlike a kinetic battle, which primarily kills young men on the front lines, the virus performed a targeted eradication of the entire human infrastructure. It swept through the densely packed, fortified town, killing with horrific efficiency. Crucially, the virus wiped out the specialists. It killed the veteran gunsmiths, who knew how to repair a shattered flintlock. It killed the artillery operators, who understood the exact powder charges required for the swivel guns, without bursting the barrels. It destroyed the military engineers, who possessed the institutional knowledge to maintain the structural integrity of the bastions. The virus dismantled the mechanics of the fortress from the inside out. Without the specialists to operate the guns, without the powder to fire them, and without the diplomatic leverage to buy more, the geometric walls became a static, infected tomb. Weakened by demographic collapse and starved of ammunition, the remnants of the Susquehannocks were eventually forced to abandon their great fort, falling victim to a renewed, relentless Iroquois offensive in the 1670s. History is a cold, brutal game of endurance. The Susquehannocks were a terrifying anomaly in the system of 17th century warfare. They played the game of European logistics and ballistics better than the colonists themselves, proving that a native nation could adapt to the industrial age, build defensive superstructures, and fight an expanding empire to an absolute, bloody standstill. But their ultimate erasure provides an unforgiving lesson in military reality. You can possess the finest artillery, you can build the most advanced architecture on the continent, and you can field the most disciplined soldiers. But if you do not control the manufacture of your own ammunition, you are operating on borrowed time. When the supply chain breaks, even the most impenetrable walls will eventually fall. The collapse of the Susquehannocks was the last true technological resistance before the British Empire fully clamped its iron grip over the eastern seaboard. The silence that followed their defeat was not the peace of a conquered land. It was the absolute silence of a rusted cannon sinking into the mud of an empty forest. The year is 1764. The banks of the Muskingum River, deep in the Ohio country. The war is technically over. Colonel Henry Bouquet has marched 1,500 men into the heart of the territory. He has a gun to the head of the Shawnee and Delaware nations. His demand is non-negotiable: return the white captives. Bouquet expects a scene of biblical salvation. He expects hundreds of civilized Christians to run from the woods, weeping with relief, falling into the arms of their liberators. He expects to be the hero who unlocks the dungeon door. He is wrong. The people coming out of the woods aren't victims. They are furious. Look at the man in the front. He is white, born in Pennsylvania, but his ears are slit. His nose is pierced with silver. His face is painted in jagged streaks of vermilion and soot. Yet he isn't running toward the soldiers. He is screaming at them. He has to be dragged. Look at the woman behind him. She is clutching a Shawnee warrior, her husband. She is wailing. Not tears of joy, but tears of absolute devastation. She is being ripped away from her family to be returned to strangers she hasn't seen in a decade. The soldiers are confused. They try to liberate these people, but the captives are biting, kicking, and spitting. They escape back into the tree line the moment the guards look away. Children are being tied hand and foot to horses like baggage. The British officers write in their journals that the scene is distressing. That is a polite way of saying it was a disaster. They thought they were bringing civilization to the wilderness. But the people of the wilderness looked at civilization and said, "Tut no." This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a mass arrest. History loves a simple story. It tells us the frontier was a war between the savage and the civilized. It tells us that every white person taken by the tribes lived in a nightmare, praying for the day they could return. It is a lie. The documents from 1764 don't lie. They describe men washing the paint off their faces with tears. They describe women risking execution to run back to the wigwams. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. And today, we are looking at the people who tasted true freedom and refused to spit it out. To understand why they fought to stay in the woods, you have to burn the postcard image of the colonies. Forget the brave pioneers. For the bottom 50% of the population, the frontier was a labor camp. If you were a poor immigrant in 1750, you were likely an indentured servant, a temporary slave. You sold yourself for 7 years just to pay for the boat ride. Your body was collateral. You could be beaten, traded, and starved. The settlements were mud pits of disease and debt. The church watched your every move. The magistrate taxed your labor. You lived in a rigid hierarchy where you were defined by your father's name and the coin in your pocket. It was a system of thou shalt not. The civilization the British offered was a cage. It had walls of log and laws of iron. Even Benjamin Franklin, a man who loved civilization, couldn't deny it. He wrote to a friend, completely baffled, "When a white person has lived a while among them, if you ransom them, they take the first opportunity to escape again into the woods." Franklin called it a mystery. I call it evidence. The savages had built a better society than he had. So how does a terrified captive become a warrior who refuses to leave? It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was a passport. The tribes didn't take captives just to torture them. They took them to replace the dead. It was a mourning war. The process was brutal, but it had a purpose. It began at the river. Imagine the water is freezing. It's October. You are dragged into the current by 3 elderly women. They grab you by the arms, and they start to scrub. They use sand and rough herbs. It hurts. They scrub until your skin is raw. They are not washing off dirt. They are washing off Europe. They are washing away your baptism, your debt, and your colonial ghost. When you come out of the water, you are dressed in dry buckskin. You are greased with bear fat. And then, the matriarch looks at you and gives you a name. You are not John Smith anymore. You are the son who died last winter. You are given his spot by the fire. You are given his role. This is the pivot. In the colonies, you were trash. You were a servant. Here, you are blood. If the tribe starves, you starve. If they feast, you feast. For a boy who grew up dodging the whip of a master, this wasn't captivity. It was a promotion. This is where the British Empire lost the argument. They assumed their culture was superior because they had stone buildings and written laws. But the white Indians found something intoxicating: autonomy. First, there were no prisons. Think about that. A society with 0 cages. Justice was personal, immediate, and based on restitution, not punishment. Second, there were no tyrants. A chief couldn't order a man to fight. He had to convince him. Leaders were servants, not masters. And then there were the women. In the colonies, a white woman was property. She moved from her father's house to her husband's house. She owned nothing. In the longhouse, the woman was the owner. The lineage ran through her. She controlled the food supply. She appointed the leaders. If a husband was lazy, she could divorce him by simply putting his belongings outside the door. Imagine a white woman, captured at 16, who has spent 5 years living as a respected head of a household. Now Colonel Bouquet shows up. He drags her back to a settlement where she will be scrubbed, put in a corset, told to shut up, and treated like a broodmare. Is it any wonder she fought him? Is it any wonder she ran back to the woods the first night she could? They didn't stay because they were wild. They stayed because they were free. Let's go back to the river in 1764. The sun is setting. The British guards are nervous. They are watching their own rescued citizens like hawks. In the shadows, ropes are being cut. Silently. One by one, the victims are slipping away. They are shedding the wool blankets of the king and disappearing into the tree line. They are going home. We like to think of history as an elevator. We tell ourselves that no one would ever choose to get off, but thousands did. They looked at our taxes, our jails, and our poverty, and they rejected it. They realized the forest was the upgrade. The mystery isn't why they stayed. The mystery is why we never learned from them. Imagine the heavy, suffocating weight of an oven wrapped in a wet wool blanket. That is the air of Central Florida in August. Now, put on a high-collared, heavy blue wool uniform, strap 40 pounds of gear, a canteen, and a 9-pound Springfield musket to your back, and step into black water that reaches your waist. The water smells of ancient, decomposing vegetation and sulfur. The razor-sharp edges of the sawgrass slice through your trousers, leaving hundreds of microscopic paper cuts across your thighs that instantly fill with stagnant, bacteria-rich mud. Above you, the Spanish moss hangs from the live oaks like the ragged shrouds of dead men. You cannot see the horizon. You cannot see the enemy. You can only hear the deafening, maddening drone of a million mosquitoes and the erratic, terrified splashing of the man in front of you. You were told this was going to be a swift, punitive expedition. You were told that the United States Army, a modern, disciplined, European-style military machine, would march down, intimidate a few scattered bands of indigenous people, and be back in Washington for a parade. You were lied to. You have just waded into the 19th century equivalent of the American Vietnam. As the Surgeon General of the United States Army would later write in a classified assessment of the campaign, the climate is a more deadly enemy than the Indian. Our troops are subjected to a toxic atmosphere, wading through swamps generating poisonous miasma, where the very act of drawing a breath is an invitation to the grave. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. Today we are conducting a raw anatomical examination of the Second Seminole War. We are stripping away the sanitized Hollywood illusions of frontier glory to look at a 7-year survival horror. We are going to break down how a brilliant guerrilla syndicate and a ruthless, predatory environment ground the American military apparatus into the mud, leaving behind nothing but unmarked graves and the only indigenous nation to never surrender. The machinery of this catastrophe was set into motion by a piece of paper. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a legislative mandate to clear the eastern United States of its native populations and march them to the barren dust of Oklahoma. For the tribes of the Southeast, this was the Trail of Tears. But down in the dense, subtropical labyrinth of the Florida Territory, the Seminole people looked at the eviction notice and flatly refused. The Seminoles were not an ancient, static tribe. They were a fiercely independent amalgamation of Creek refugees, escaped African slaves, the Black Seminoles, and remnants of older Florida tribes. They had built a thriving, autonomous society in the swamps. When the U.S. government presented the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, a document designed to legally steal their land, the response was not diplomatic. The legend, backed by the oral histories of the time, states that the young, charismatic war leader Osceola approached the table where the federal Indian agent sat. Osceola did not ask for a quill. He drew his hunting knife, raised it above his head, and drove the steel straight through the treaty, pinning it to the oak table. "This," he supposedly declared, "is the only treaty I will ever make with the white man." The United States responded with the arrogance typical of a rising empire. They dispatched the regular army, assuming that a display of cannons, dragoons, and marching columns would instantly shatter the native resistance. They fundamentally misunderstood the theater of war. They brought a Napoleonic doctrine into a prehistoric swamp. The logistical collapse was instantaneous and absolute. To wage a traditional war, an army needs supply lines. They need roads for their heavy, iron-axled wagons, their massive caissons of artillery, and their slow-moving herds of beef cattle. Florida has no roads. It is a vast, interconnected sponge of limestone, muck, and wetlands. The quartermaster reports from the first years of the war read like the desperate dispatches of a doomed expedition. One quartermaster noted, "Our transport is entirely paralyzed. Wagons sink to their beds in the treacherous sands and mud. Horses rupture their hearts, attempting to pull them free. Our salt pork spoils within 48 hours of opening the barrels, turning rancid in the infernal humidity. And our hard bread is consumed by a green mold before it reaches the mouths of the men." The American soldiers were tethered to these sinking wagons. They moved at a crawl, exhausted before they even saw combat, hacking blindly through the palmetto scrub with machetes. In stark contrast, the Seminoles operated on a system of frictionless, aquatic mobility. Their primary vehicle was the dugout canoe, a vessel carved from a single massive cypress log. These canoes could glide silently through water just 6 inches deep. A Seminole war party could carry 50 pounds of dried venison, coontie root flour, and lead in a canoe, traverse 50 miles of the Everglades in a single night, and hide the boat beneath the sawgrass before dawn. They moved like water moccasins over the very terrain that was swallowing the U.S. Army alive. Osceola and the Seminole leadership understood a cold, tactical truth. If you meet a superior industrial force on an open field, you will be destroyed. Therefore, there would be no open fields. There would be no lines of battle. There would only be the ambush, the sniper, and the terror of the unseen. The Seminoles waged a masterclass in psychological and asymmetrical warfare. They dictated the terms of every single engagement. They would wait for an American column to stretch itself thin along a narrow, muddy trail, bogged down by their heavy wool coats and sinking boots. Then, the swamp would explode. A volley of musket fire would erupt from the dense thickets of cabbage palms and oak scrub. The accuracy of the Seminole warriors was terrifying. They targeted the officers first, dropping the men on horseback to shatter the chain of command, then targeted the artillerymen to silence the cannons. Before the American soldiers could form a line, fix bayonets, and fire a blind return volley into the trees, the Seminoles were gone. They dissolved into the Spanish moss and the deep mud, leaving the soldiers to fire at shadows. Captain John T. Sprague, an American officer who served in the grueling campaign, documented the sheer frustration of fighting this invisible enemy in his diaries. They are here, and they are nowhere. A commander may scour a hammock for days, finding nothing but the tracks of a deer, only to have his rear guard decimated by a foe that seems to rise from the very mud itself. They possess a capacity for concealment that defies European comprehension. I have seen evidence of warriors submerging themselves entirely in the black water for hours, breathing only through a hollow reed, waiting for our patrols to pass within inches of their hidden blades. This wasn't a war of conquest. It was a war of attrition. The most famous example of this was the Dade Massacre in December 1835. Major Francis Dade was leading a column of 110 men from Fort Brooke, modern-day Tampa, to Fort King, Ocala. They were marching through an area of open pine barrens, thinking they were safe. They were wrong. Osceola's allies, led by Chiefs McCanopy and Jumper, had shadowed them for days. When the Americans reached a patch of high saw palmettos, the Seminoles opened fire. The first volley wiped out half the command, including Major Dade. The surviving soldiers desperately tried to build a crude triangular breastwork out of pine logs, but they were pinned down, picked off one by snipers hidden in the grass. Of the 110 American soldiers, only 3 survived, crawling away severely wounded. The psychological toll on the US Army was devastating. The soldiers were not fighting men. They felt they were fighting the forest itself. They spent weeks marching through waist-deep water, waiting for the sudden crack of a rifle, unable to sleep, unable to dry their rotting boots, jumping at every snap of a twig. The stress broke the minds of farm boys from Ohio and New York who had never seen an alligator, let alone a warrior who could vanish into a fog bank. But Osceola's warriors were not the deadliest force in Florida. The Seminoles had a silent, microscopic ally that inflicted more casualties on the United States military than every musket ball and arrow combined. The environment was a systemic meat grinder. The U.S. Army built a network of crude wooden forts across the interior of Florida to serve as supply depots and garrisons. These forts, built of green, unseasoned pine logs, were erected directly in the middle of stagnant, mosquito-infested swamps. They became isolated incubators for disease. To look at the official medical ledgers of the Second Seminole War is to look at a clinical breakdown of the human frame. Out of the approximately 2,500 United States soldiers who died during the 7-year campaign, only about 300 were killed in combat. Over 1,200 men died from disease. The primary executioner was malaria, known then as the ague, or swamp fever. The Americans did not yet understand that the disease was carried by the Anopheles mosquito. They believed it was caused by miasma, bad air rising from the rotting vegetation. The men were bitten by the thousands every single night. The progression of the disease is a brutal physical dismantling. It begins with a violent, bone-rattling chill. A soldier would sit beside a roaring fire in the sweltering Florida heat, wrapped in 3 blankets, his teeth chattering so hard they cracked. Then comes the fever, pushing the core temperature to 105 degrees. The red blood cells burst, clogging the kidneys and the liver. The men lay in the crude, suffocating wooden hospitals, sweating through their cots, their skin turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow as their organs failed. If malaria didn't kill them, yellow fever did. Transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, yellow fever induces a catastrophic hemorrhagic collapse. The virus attacks the liver, preventing the blood from clotting. The soldiers would suffer agonizing joint pain, followed by the terrifying hallmark of the disease, the black vomit. They would literally vomit up the coagulated blood leaking into their own stomachs. They bled from their gums, their noses, and their eyes, and dying in a state of toxic delirium. And beneath the fevers was the constant, grinding misery of dysentery. Clean water was a luxury that did not exist on the march. Desperate, heat-exhausted soldiers drank directly from stagnant cypress swamps, ingesting amoebas and bacteria. The resulting intestinal infection stripped the lining of their bowels. Men died of sheer dehydration, passing pure blood and mucus, screaming in agony while surrounded by millions of gallons of undrinkable water. The Surgeon General's reports painted a grim picture of these wilderness outposts. The hospitals at Fort King and Fort Drane are overflowing with the wretched wrecks of men. The stench of dysentery and gangrene hangs over the palisades. We are not treating a fighting force. We are maintaining a hospice for the doomed. The climate is melting the flesh from their bones faster than the enemy can shoot them. The Seminoles, meanwhile, had lived in this environment for generations. They possessed generational knowledge of the terrain. They knew where the clear springs were, and they understood the medicinal herbs necessary to combat the fevers. The swamp was their fortress. To the Americans, it was a graveyard. As the years dragged on, the war became a massive, bleeding ulcer on the federal budget. The United States government poured resources into Florida with an escalating sense of desperation. They deployed bloodhounds imported from Cuba to track the warriors through the swamps. The hounds either died of the heat or were killed by the Seminoles. They deployed flat-bottomed gunboats. They burned native crops. Nothing worked. The war consumed the careers of the finest officers in the U.S. military. 3 commanding generals, Edmund Gaines, Winfield Scott, and Thomas Jessup, were either disgraced or frustrated to the breaking point by their inability to corner the enemy. General Jessup became so desperate that he abandoned the fundamental rules of civilized warfare. In October 1837, Osceola approached an American encampment under a white flag of truce to negotiate the release of prisoners. Jessup ordered his men to surround Osceola, strike him over the head, and bind him in chains. It was a staggering violation of international military ethics, a cowardly capture that shocked the American public and turned Osceola into a martyr. Osceola would die of a throat infection in a damp prison cell in South Carolina a few months later. But even the treacherous capture of their most famous leader did not break the Seminoles. Other chiefs, Cocucci, Wildcat, Sam Jones, and Billy Bowlegs, stepped into the vacuum, leading the American army deeper into the impenetrable sawgrass of the deep Everglades. By 1842, the United States had reached its breaking point. The Second Seminole War had cost the federal treasury an estimated $40,000. To put that in perspective, the entire budget of the United States government in 1835 was roughly $18 million. They had spent more than double the nation's annual income trying to clear a swamp of a few thousand people, and they had failed. There was no grand surrender. There was no treaty signed on a battleship. The United States simply realized they could not win the physics of the environment. In 1842, Congress passed the Armed Occupation Act, declaring the war over without actually achieving their objective. The Army quietly packed up its rotting tents, loaded its emaciated, malaria-stricken survivors onto ships, and sailed away. A few thousand Seminoles had been captured and sent west, but a core group of a few hundred retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible heart of the Everglades, the Big Cypress Swamp. The U.S. Army refused to follow them in. They left them alone. We look back at the history of the 19th century, and we are fed a narrative of unstoppable industrial progress. We are taught that the frontier was a wild beast that was inevitably tamed by the railroad, the telegraph, and the sheer willpower of the American soldier. But if you look at the mud of Central Florida, you see the hard, unyielding limit of that progress. The Second Seminole War was not a tale of heroic cavalry charges. It was a 7-year masterclass in human endurance and tactical brilliance by a people who refused to be erased. The Seminoles weaponized the heat, they weaponized the water, and they weaponized the very insects of the air. They forced a modern superpower to realize that all the cannons and military academies in the world are useless when the ground beneath your feet is trying to eat you. To this day, the Seminole tribe of Florida holds a title that no other native group in North America can claim. They are the unconquered. They never signed a formal peace treaty with the United States government ending the war. They didn't have to. They beat the machine until the machine gave up and walked away. The next time you walk through the humid air of a Florida evening, listen to the buzzing of the mosquitoes and look at the dark water reflecting the moon. Understand that you are looking at an undefeated defensive perimeter. You are looking at a swamp that swallowed an army and the ghosts of the men who knew exactly how to use it. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think. You've seen the textbooks. You've seen the sanitized oil paintings in the galleries of the East. The noble warrior sitting by a flickering evening fire, patiently waiting for a choice cut of bison meat to develop a perfect, golden brown crust. It is a lie. It is a sweet, sterilized fiction created by civilized people who are too terrified of their own true predatory nature. In the 1750s, on the Great Plains, no one waited for dinner to be ready. Dinner was ready the exact second the bison's heart stopped beating. The concept of medium rare didn't exist because the concept of cooking was often a luxury that cost more than it was worth. A true warrior of the 1750s wasn't a cook. He was a survival engineer. While the white smoke from his flintlock musket still hung in the heavy, humid air of the prairie, he was already elbow-deep in a steaming harvest. He wasn't looking for flavor. He wasn't looking for a culinary experience. He was looking for caloric density and chemical survival. He didn't wait for the fire because fire is the enemy of raw biological efficiency. Heat destroys the very enzymes that make you an apex predator. Instead of roasting the meat, he consumed the raw, vital organs and took in a dark, iron-rich essence directly from the source of life. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't primitive tradition. It was biological mathematics. History is never what you think. Imagine a biological mechanism operating at the absolute limit of physical wear. A 1750s warrior is not just a man. He is a high-performance bio-object, burning 6,000 to 8,000 calories a day while tracking a herd under a scorched, iron sky. To keep this mechanism from seizing, he required fuel of extreme quality, fuel that could be absorbed into the bloodstream almost instantly, without the massive energy expenditure required for long-term digestion. The bison's liver was not merely an organ. In the visceral reality of the 1750s, it was a biological capacitor. It held the densest concentration of glucose, vitamin A, and hemi-iron in the entire prairie. When the warrior extracted this prize in the immediate aftermath of the hunt, he wasn't looking for salt or spices. He was looking for a chemical bypass. Raw liver is a direct injection of energy. Fire denatures the enzymes and incinerates the vitamin C. For the warrior, cooking the liver was an unacceptable waste of resources, a metabolic error. He knew instinctively what we have forgotten, that raw liver is brain fuel. It is what allows the human eye to track a slight movement in the tall grass from a kilometer away. It is what keeps the nervous system firing with zero latency. Then there was the heart. Pure, incredibly dense muscle tissue, saturated with coenzymes and iron. They claimed it in the very seconds after the fall, before the heat of the beast had faded. Each piece was a capsule of caloric density. They swallowed it warm, feeling the heat of another life migrating into their own core. This was the ultimate act of biological absorption. One engine had stopped so that another could gain additional horsepower. The cynical conclusion: nature knows no mercy. It only knows the debit and credit of energy. Morality doesn't stop muscular fatigue. Ethics don't cure the tremors of iron deficiency. Raw fuel does. Those who waited for the meat to cook through usually became food for the wolves before the sun ever touched the horizon. The greatest mistake of the modern human is our civilized gag reflex. We have become addicted to the sterility of plastic packaging and the aesthetics of the plate. But in the 1750s, the internal processing chambers were the most valuable biological trophy on the field of the hunt. This wasn't waste. It was a hermetically sealed capsule of semi-digested plant matter, a ready-made cocktail of enzymes, probiotics, and B vitamins. The Plains warrior had no time to gather roots or study botany. He didn't need to. He hacked the complex, multi-chambered digestive system of the bison. By consuming the raw vessel along with its partially fermented contents, he gained access to the energy of the grasses and grains that the human body is physically incapable of processing on its own. This was chemical survival in its most primordial form. It was a visceral method of obtaining vitamin K, critical for survival in a world where a single deep scratch could lead to a slow, septic decline. To the European observer, this was savagery. To the warrior, it was a high-efficiency nutrient transfer. Why spend days gathering plants when the bison has already done the work for you and concentrated the results in a convenient, natural vessel? But the real liquid gold was the vital essence. That dark, iron-rich fluid that became available the moment the prize was opened with a stone blade. They took it in by the handful, while it still carried the heat and oxygen of life. In 1750, this essence was better than any water from a muddy creek. It was the perfect natural electrolyte solution, saturated with organic salts and proteins. It didn't just quench thirst. It restored cellular balance in minutes after a 10-hour run. You see disgusting habits. I see flawless energy management. When you are 300 miles from the nearest trading post, your survival depends entirely on how quickly you can turn another creature's life force into your own strength. Now look at the men who sought to conquer these people. The European explorers and soldiers of the 1750s were true biological ruins. Their diet, salt pork, hardtack, and stagnant water, was a perfect recipe for slow-motion collapse. They were filled with sodium, but absolutely hollow inside. Scurvy rotted their gums until their teeth fell into their soup. A total lack of vitamin B12 turned their muscles into atrophied jelly. They carried the most advanced flintlock muskets and the most precise maps, but their own bodies were in a permanent state of metabolic default. On the other side stood the Plains warrior. Because of his diet of raw, unprocessed internals and vital fluids, his system was maximally saturated with oxygen. His vision was sharper than any marksman from the British or French armies, thanks to the massive surplus of vitamin A. His endurance was phenomenal because he wasn't fighting his own biology. This was a battle between a high-performance biological mechanism and a rusted machine running on industrial waste. The Europeans called them savages, specifically because they consumed the unrefined harvest of the hunt. But it was these savages who could run 40 miles through a heat wave without losing focus, while the European soldier fainted from the first sign of heat stroke or iron deficiency. This wasn't an advantage in technology. It was an advantage in biological mathematics. Raw nutrition gave the warrior the ability to recover twice as fast. Vitamin C from unrefined glands made his immune system an impenetrable fortress against the conditions that mowed down white men by the thousands. The frontier was a filter, and it favored the visceral over the refined. The cynical conclusion: technology is a ghost if your own biology is bankrupt. You can have the finest steel blade in the world, but it won't help you if your hand shakes from malnutrition, while your enemy can see your silhouette in the twilight as clearly as if it were noon. This primordial power rested on one single massive resource. The bison was not just an animal to be hunted. It was a mobile warehouse of biological weaponry that the warriors had learned to unlock. It was a closed energy loop. The prairie provided the grass. The bison concentrated the nutrients in its organs, and the warrior harvested that energy in its purest, rawest state. When the herds began to vanish, that biological advantage vanished with them. It wasn't a defeat on a battlefield. It was a collapse of the supply chain. Without the primal harvest, without the dense core of muscle, and without the warm, vital fluids, the warriors became as vulnerable as the men they fought. Their metabolism, tuned for extreme quality, simply could not function on a government ration of white flour, salt, and refined sugar. The bodies that were once high-performance machines for processing visceral energy turned into flaccid shells, poisoned by cheap carbohydrates. It was the final audit of the frontier, and the balance came up red. We have traded this visceral potency for the luxury of comfort. We take synthetic pills in plastic bottles and wonder why we feel so perpetually exhausted. We look back at history through the distorting filter of modern morality, forgetting that we are, at our core, merely biological containers for energy. Morality is a luxury we allowed ourselves only after we stopped fearing the math of hunger. But when the system fails and the supermarket shelves go empty, the mathematics will return. And it will be just as primal, visceral, and merciless as it was 300 years ago on the Great Plains. So my name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.